You are 15 years old, your wrists still marked by the grip of soldiers who tore you from your mother's arms. The marble gates of the imperial palace loom before you, so white they almost blind your eyes, yet beneath the surface you smell the damp rot of blood scrubbed clean but never forgotten. Incense curls through the air, masking something sour, something human. Each step echoes too loud, as though the walls themselves are judging your fate. In distant corridors, you hear a woman scream, not the sharp cry of defiance, but the broken wail of someone who has already learned that resistance is useless. Here, inside Rome's heart, you are no longer a daughter, no longer a person. You are a vessel. Your body catalogued, your future erased, your very memory reshaped to serve the emperor's whims. Outside, the empire dazzles with aqueducts and triumphal arches, legions marching in perfect formation. But behind these golden facades, Rome hid its most terrifying secrets, secrets carved not in marble, but in human flesh. If these shadows grip you already, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support fuels more journeys into the buried darkness of history. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, ruling over tens of millions of souls. Its monuments still stand, from the Colosseum to aqueducts that defied time itself. But what survives in stone is only half the story. The other half lies in fragments of scandalous biographies, in the accounts of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, and in the whispers of poets and chroniclers who dared describe what emperors wished forgotten. For the women who became empresses, concubines, or captives within those marble walls, Rome's grandeur was a mask. Their suffering was not the chaos of rumor, but the outcome of deliberate, systematic control. An empire of intimacy turned into a weapon of power. The true nightmare began not with the lash of a whip or the thrust of a sword, but with a ledger. In the palaces of Rome, beauty was currency, and the bodies of women were catalogued with the same detachment as shipments of grain or marble. Chroniclers describe how officials moved through conquered provinces like merchants inspecting stock. A girl's age, height, and physical condition were noted. Her lineage was sometimes recorded, not to honor her family, but to measure how useful her bloodline might be for imperial display or political breeding. Suetonius, in his lurid biographies, reveals how emperors like Caligula and Nero ordered women to be gathered from noble households under the guise of honor. The euphemism masked the truth. These daughters were seized not as wives of choice but as living ornaments to the emperor's court. The act was systematic. They were not addressed by name in records, but reduced to cold designations. 10 virgins, age 14 to 16, in excellent condition. Numbers beside their descriptions indicated value, just as amphorae of wine or sacks of spice would be tallied. Imagine a mother being forced to watch as her child was stripped of her identity, renamed, and entered into this ledger. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as the conquest itself. Rome knew that to shatter a people's spirit, it was not enough to take their gold or their land. You had to take their children, erase their names, and reforge their memories. Entire provinces learned to fear not just the march of legions, but the quiet scratch of a scribe's stylus. Once inside the imperial walls, the young women were subject to rituals designed to annihilate their past. Some were rechristened with names tied to Roman goddesses, Julia, Livia, or Domitilla, not as a gift of honor, but as an erasure of who they had been. Chroniclers whisper of training houses, where they were taught not only etiquette but silence, obedience, and the art of concealment. One writer compares the process to breaking horses, the same term used in agricultural manuals for taming wild beasts. The cruelty was never random. It was organized, calculated, and profitable. Procuring officers received bonuses for delivering women of rare beauty or noble ancestry. Slave markets near the Palatine Hill flourished, where the value of a captive might rise or fall like grain futures. In one account preserved by Dio, the demand for blonde-haired captives from the north was so high that some Roman traders dyed the hair of darker women to increase their price. Even within the palace, market logic prevailed. Beauty was commodified, sold, and consumed. The journey itself was another weapon. Ships carrying women from far provinces became floating prisons. Packed into dark holds, denied food and water, They endured weeks at sea under conditions designed to crush both body and spirit. Mortality rates of 15 to 20% were euphemistically listed in shipping records as acceptable losses. When bodies grew too many, they were thrown overboard, marked in the ledgers with the same dispassionate note used for spoiled grain. What awaited survivors was no less suffocating. Archaeological digs beneath Rome have uncovered the foundations of chambers historians believe were used for forced rituals of conversion, small rooms with hooks and restraints embedded into walls, their function sanitized in official records as discipline. Inscriptions detail cycles of pregnancy tracked not by maternal care, but by efficiency. A woman's value increased if she could produce children of imperial bloodline, and decreased if she miscarried or proved infertile. This was not family, it was livestock accounting, and yet the empire took care to wrap this brutality in grandeur. Public ceremonies disguised coercion as honor. Girls were paraded in processions, presented as gifts from the gods, while their families wept in silence. The euphemisms multiplied: dedication, offering, union. Behind each word lay coercion, violence, and despair. Families across the empire adapted to this terror in desperate ways. Archaeological evidence from Thrace and Dacia suggests parents would scar or deform their daughters, hoping to render them undesirable to Roman scouts. Chroniclers record mothers cutting hair, blackening teeth, or even inflicting injuries on their own children, not out of cruelty, but out of love. Better a scarred daughter alive in obscurity than a perfect one lost to the emperor's gaze. The trauma spread like a poison. Villages organized festivals of secrecy, hiding girls in caves during census seasons when Roman officials made their rounds. Oral traditions from the Balkans tell of lullabies sung to infants promising protection from the Eagle of Rome, a metaphor for the imperial grip that stole children as easily as land. The fate of those who became empresses was scarcely better. Consider Messalina, wife of Claudius, condemned not for treason of arms but for alleged excess of desire. Ancient writers delight in exaggerating her supposed immorality, yet what echoes through their words is not her guilt, but the empire's need for a scapegoat. When emperors faltered, wives were blamed, tried in public, and executed in spectacle. The humiliation of one woman was meant to reassert the authority of all men. This was psychological warfare on an industrial scale. By normalizing the disposability of women closest to power, Rome broadcast a warning to every household in its vast dominion: no daughter was safe, no wife secure, no mother beyond reach. The empire conquered not only with legions, but with fear planted inside family walls. Even as monuments rose higher, the ledgers remained. Lines of ink that reduced human lives to commodities, columns of numbers that spoke louder than the cries of the vanished. Rome's glory was built not just on marble and steel, but on the systematic erasure of its forbidden empresses, women remembered only through the cruelty inflicted upon them. The system tightened its grip as decades turned into centuries. What began as opportunistic seizure of women hardened into policy, a machinery of control as predictable as tax collection. Chroniclers note how certain seasons became synonymous with fear. Just as farmers knew when to plant grain, families knew when scouts would ride into their villages, searching for the next candidates for Rome's palaces. The empire reduced intimacy itself into bureaucracy, and its reach extended even into the womb. Records from the reign of Domitian reveal chilling calculations. Fertility cycles were tracked in detail, not to preserve family lineage, but to maximize imperial yield. Women of noble provinces were monitored like agricultural stock, their pregnancies noted alongside harvest schedules. Surviving inscriptions catalog miscarriages as wastage, as if a lost child were equivalent to a spoiled amphora of wine. The euphemistic coldness of these words magnified the horror, a mother's grief flattened into a tally mark. For those who survived the selection, daily life inside the imperial court was itself a form of warfare. Surveillance was constant. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged could be interpreted as disloyalty. Concubines and empresses alike were set against one another, their intimacy weaponized into rivalry. Caligula famously forced noblewomen to dine at his table, then paraded them before their humiliated husbands, declaring their shame a gift to the empire. The psychological devastation of these orchestrated humiliations rippled outward. If Rome could so casually debase its elite, what chance did the provinces have? Yet Rome cloaked this in spectacle. Festivals blurred the line between ritual and abuse. In some accounts, women were forced to reenact myths of goddesses before cheering crowds, plays where violation was disguised as divine drama. The public applauded, believing themselves witnesses to sacred tradition, while the women endured degradation masked as performance. Chroniclers like Juvenal derided these spectacles, yet his sneering tone often mocked the women more than the system that consumed them. Even criticism became another layer of violence. Families outside the palace learned to live in dread of rumor. A whisper that an emperor desired a girl could seal her fate before any soldier appeared. Villages surrendered entire generations without a fight, convinced that resistance only meant mass slaughter. Tacitus records towns in Judea that capitulated when scouts hinted that the daughters of the village pleased the eye of Rome. 2. No legion needed to march. Terror itself became a weapon sharper than steel. What was stolen was not only the body, but the memory. Women who bore children to emperors often saw them erased when dynasties shifted. Infants were declared illegitimate, their names struck from records, their statues destroyed. Even in motherhood, these women were denied permanence. A son could grow to command armies, yet his mother's name would vanish from the marble reliefs, her existence reduced to a footnote in some hostile chronicler's gossip. This was systematic erasure, Rome rewriting memory to suit its politics, sacrificing truth for the stability of its myth. The economic machinery behind this dehumanization was staggering. Procurers were paid in gold, but also granted lands and privileges for delivering desirable stock. Markets around the Palatine buzzed with speculation, as if trading in futures. Letters preserved from provincial governors complain of shortages of grain and wood, yet never fail to include tallies of women sent for imperial service. Even in famine, Rome ensured the palace's appetite was satisfied. Archaeological excavations in Ostia have uncovered tablets listing shipments of captives. Next to crates of olive oil and consignments of wine appear chilling notes: 5 from Cappadocia, 6 from Numidia, 4 from Hispania, sound in health. The deadliest irony is that these records endure more clearly than the names of the women themselves. Stone preserved their reduction, while their voices turned to dust. And through it all, Rome convinced itself this was order. Philosophers rationalized it as natural hierarchy, as fate ordained by the gods. Seneca wrote that fortune assigns roles, and one must accept them without protest. But for the women who lived these roles, fate was not divine. It was brutality sanctified by ink and law. Some empresses tried to resist. Agrippina the Younger wielded influence through her son Nero, only to be accused of incest and conspiracy. Her murder was staged as necessity, her reputation blackened by rumor until her humanity was drowned in scandal. Others, like Julia Domna, sought refuge in philosophy and patronage of the arts, yet even she was remembered more for her endurance than her achievements. Resistance was tolerated only until it threatened the emperor's image, then it was crushed with merciless precision. The cruelty metastasized into society itself. Roman citizens came to view imperial women as cursed, dangerous, corrupting, destined to fall. Gossip became a weapon, and rumor itself a death sentence. This normalization completed the cycle. When humiliation became entertainment, no atrocity seemed unthinkable. Pause and imagine, you are a father in a Gallic village. A soldier arrives not with sword drawn, but with a parchment bearing the emperor's seal. He need not kill you. He need only announce that your daughter's beauty has been noted. Do you resist and watch your family slaughtered? Or do you surrender her, convincing yourself that perhaps she will be treated kindly in Rome? For thousands, this was not a hypothetical but a lived nightmare. By the time Rome reached its height, this machinery was invisible, woven into the very fabric of empire. Just as taxes and tributes flowed from the provinces, so too did women, captured, catalogued, consumed. The empire's greatness was built not only on conquest of land, but on conquest of intimacy, turning private lives into state property. This was not the chaos of excess, nor the accidents of lust. It was a system deliberate, calculated, and monstrously efficient. And so, the The forbidden empresses of Rome lived and died within a paradox. Elevated to thrones yet denied humanity. Remembered in scandal yet forgotten in truth, they embodied both the empire's majesty and its most terrifying secret, that power, unchecked, can make a prison even of the heart. By the time the empire settled into its long maturity, the exploitation of women within the palace had become more than a custom. It was a machine, every wheel turned with chilling precision, designed not only to satisfy the emperor's desires, but to ensure the empire itself fed upon the intimacy of its most vulnerable. The records grow most disturbing when they reveal how the reproductive lives of women were placed under surveillance. Chroniclers note that empresses and concubines were subjected to invasive scrutiny, their menstrual cycles tracked with the same precision as military campaigns. Fertility was not a private matter but a state resource. Inscriptions recovered from a villa near Tivoli suggest that midwives employed by the court were required to submit written accounts of pregnancies, miscarriages, and births, each recorded in ledgers that read more like farm inventories than medical reports. A woman's worth was measured by what her body could produce. If she birthed a healthy child, especially a son, her value increased. If she miscarried, her stock fell, her privileges curtailed, her place at the table diminished. The language of livestock suffused every line. To yield one healthy heir, the system accepted countless broken bodies. The ratio, coldly calculated, was considered efficient, but the horrors did not end with fertility. Public humiliation became another cog in the machine. Emperors turned their wives into instruments of political theater. Claudius's wife Messalina, accused of betrayal, was dragged before the court not merely to be condemned but to serve as an example. Chroniclers describe her paraded through the palace in shame, forced to stand as accusations were hurled like stones. Whether the charges were true or fabricated mattered little. Her humiliation reasserted the emperor's authority. Even the most powerful empresses could be transformed into scapegoats. Agrippina the Younger, once the architect of her son Nero's rise, was denounced in public speeches as a sorceress, accused of unnatural desire, her image twisted into a grotesque warning. The spectacle of her downfall, her pleas ignored, her body struck down, was celebrated as proof that no woman could stand above Rome's male order. This transformation of justice into theater turned the suffering of women into entertainment. Trials were staged, sentences delivered with flourish, and rumors spread with deliberate speed. Every humiliation reinforced the belief that women were dangerous if unbroken, and disposable once they ceased to serve. What made it most terrifying was the normalization. These events were not seen as aberrations, but as part of Rome's natural rhythm. Citizens crowded to hear scandal recited like poetry, gossip treated as scripture. Each public disgrace fed into the collective understanding that intimacy itself belonged to the empire. A wife could be reduced to property, a mother to livestock, a daughter to a number in a ledger. Pause and consider this. Entire villages, from the sands of North Africa to the forests of Gaul, learned to surrender without battle at the mere whisper of what awaited their daughters. Legions no longer needed to raise their swords. Fear of the palace was sharper than steel, heavier than chains. The empire did not merely conquer bodies, it conquered the imagination, teaching its subjects to police themselves, to hand over their own flesh in exchange for survival. This cycle of dehumanization did not merely persist, it multiplied, feeding upon itself like a fire-consuming timber. Every humiliation created precedent, every erasure of memory became a warning, every corpse a foundation stone in the empire's architecture of fear. Rome perfected the logic of industrial exploitation centuries before factories ever existed. Where merchants calculated the cost of ships and goods, imperial bureaucrats calculated human loss. In certain records, 9 women might be seized so that one might survive to bear a child of value. The loss of the other 8 was not tragedy but arithmetic, their suffering reduced to the margin of an account book. This was efficiency at its most monstrous. Religion, too, was weaponized. Emperors cloaked their exploitation in the robes of the divine. When a young girl was forced into the palace, ceremonies proclaimed her married to the gods, her violation reframed as sacred duty. Ritual masks transformed cruelty into cosmic theater, convincing onlookers that obedience was devotion, that suffering was holiness. The message echoed across provinces. Resistance to Rome was not just rebellion, it was blasphemy. Even entertainment absorbed the cruelty. Festivals incorporated displays where imperial women were forced to play roles drawn from mythology. Ariadne abandoned, Persephone dragged to the underworld, Lucretia dishonored. These performances blurred history with theater, turning trauma into spectacle. The crowd cheered, never asking where performance ended and reality began. Over time, Rome's citizens no longer needed force to accept the system. They internalized it. Families mutilated their daughters not from hatred, but from desperate love, convinced that a scarred face or a broken limb was kinder than the palace's embrace. Cultural memory became a shield. Songs, prayers, and whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter across generations, embedding terror so deeply that survival meant compliance. The empire thrived on this feedback loop. Every abduction weakened resistance, every public trial reinforced obedience, every erased name deepened silence. Rome engineered not only roads, aqueducts, and monuments, but a society in which atrocity was invisible because it was ordinary. At the height of this system, empresses themselves became enforcers. Some, like Domitia Longina, were forced to betray rivals to secure their own precarious safety. Others became informants, their survival dependent on feeding the emperor's paranoia. Victims were compelled to participate in the machinery that consumed them, perpetuating cycles of exploitation. And so, intimacy itself, marriage, motherhood, sisterhood, was weaponized by the empire. To love too deeply was dangerous. To resist too openly was fatal. Within these contradictions, entire generations lived as shadows, their bodies occupied by Rome, their memories overwritten, their voices silenced. This was the empire's most terrifying secret, that it conquered not only through swords and legions, but through a systematic appropriation of the most private human bonds. Love was turned into leverage, fertility into currency, memory into propaganda. It was not the chaos of passion or the madness of tyrants, but the deliberate machinery of a civilization that perfected domination by reaching into the soul itself. When we step back from the fragments of chronicles, the ruins of palaces, and the cold inscriptions carved into stone, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Roman Empire was built as much on silence as on spectacle. Its monuments dazzled the eye, but its hidden machinery devoured the private lives of countless women whose names have been lost. The forbidden empresses of Rome lived not only as symbols of imperial glory, but as casualties of a system that normalized the unthinkable. Power unchecked always seeks new frontiers, and Rome's greatest conquest was not of provinces or peoples, but of intimacy itself. To erase a woman's name, to turn her fertility into an account line, to make her humiliation into theater, this was a deeper violation than any battlefield defeat. It was civilization weaponizing its own brilliance, proving that progress without compassion can turn knowledge into cruelty. And yet, the voices of these women echo still. In the bitterness of ancient poets, in the scandalous pages of Suetonius and Tacitus, in the stones unearthed by archaeologists, fragments of their existence survive. They are remembered not for their smiles, their loves, or their laughter, but for the pain inflicted upon them. Even so, to speak their stories aloud is to undo the silence emperors demanded. It is to restore some dignity to lives reduced by ink, to numbers, and by rumor to shadows. The lesson is not confined to Rome. Every empire that forgets the humanity of its people risks repeating the same descent. When we allow exploitation to be rationalized as order, when humiliation becomes entertainment, when private lives are seized by the machinery of power, we tread the same path. The marble crumbles, but the warning remains. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is that scars of this system linger in memory and myth, passed down across generations. They survive not in triumphal arches, but in whispered stories of daughters hidden from soldiers, in lullabies promising protection from the eagle of Rome, in the quiet persistence of survival itself. To remember the forbidden empresses is to resist the erasure they suffered. It is to acknowledge that behind Rome's splendor stood women whose humanity was stripped away, whose lives were rewritten, whose suffering was disguised as ritual. And in honoring them, we confront the fragility of civilization, the ease with which intimacy can be turned into terror when power is left unchallenged. If this history unsettles you, subscribe and share what struck you most in the comments. Together, we will confront the next shadow buried in the past.